John Doherty here for Tacoma's Climate Talk. Glad to have Peter Joseph and Jonathan Marshall with us today. We're going to be talking about putting a price on carbon, what that is, why we'd do that, what some of the political, economic, and social issues are. So, welcome to both of you. And Peter, could we start off? Could you just briefly introduce us to yourself, please?
Yes, good morning, John and everybody. I'm Dr. Peter Joseph. I'm a retired emergency physician. I trained at undergraduate at Columbia University and the University of Michigan. I've practiced emergency medicine for 35 years, retiring about 9 years ago to devote all my time really to working on climate change. That all started after seeing An Inconvenient Truth, which I realized described the mother of all emergencies, and I wasn't about to sit that one out. This is a Code 3 lights and sirens problem. And I'll let Jonathan introduce himself and describe what we advocate.
I'm Jonathan Marshall. I'm the longtime professional journalist. I was the economics editor of the San Francisco Chronicle, and I've written on economics, including energy issues, for the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, and many other publications. And I am joined Peter's chapter of Citizens Climate Lobby a few years ago because the organization's focus on using market-based incentives meshes wonderfully with the kind of economics that I have learned and practiced.
Really privileged to have two men with the background that you have, uniquely well suited to talk about what we're going to talk about today. So the big picture we're talking about is price on carbon, and I'm going to leave it to the two of you to decide who responds to what and sort that out. Can we just start off by breaking down a price on carbon a little bit? There's a lot of terms floating around. I think they can be confusing even to somebody that digs in a little bit. So we've got carbon fees, carbon taxes, cap and trade. How would we distinguish between, let's say, a straight up price on carbon and something like a cap and trade, which I know you have down there in California?
Let me just start by trying to avoid some of the jargon, because I hate this. Price on carbon is a term of art that you will see very often. You can Google it and there'll be millions of hits, but it's a pretty terrible term. When I look around, we're not putting a price on trees or human beings, which are both, formed of carbon. We're doing something that is very natural to people. The polluter pays principle. We are charging, in effect, taxing fossil fuel pollution. You might call it climate pollution. The burning of fossil fuels is emitting greenhouse gases, which are basically toxic to all living things when they exceed certain levels. Carbon dioxide is a necessary component of life, but at a certain level, it eventually raises the temperature of the earth through the greenhouse effect to make life intolerable. So we have to end this pollution. And a good way to do it is saying, you can't dump your gases into the atmosphere free of charge anymore. We're going to charge for that because it's very expensive to society to keep letting you do that. So because carbon dioxide has a carbon atom, we call that carbon pollution instead of carbon dioxide. Some other gases like methane also have carbon atoms, and they are also greenhouse gases. And putting a price really means putting a fee or tax on it so that people can't dump this effluent free of charge. It's, in fact, the single biggest subsidy that the fossil fuel industry gets. Forget tax incentives and breaks and so on. It's the freedom to allow their pollution to go into the atmosphere without any charge that's a gigantic subsidy. So pricing carbon means finding some mechanism. Already, fossil fuels face a modest federal excise tax. So one proposal for a carbon fee or tax is to increase that excise tax based on the amount of CO2 that fossil fuel would contribute once it's burned. So coal is extremely polluting with carbon dioxide as well as other noxious gases. It would face the stiffest levy per ton. But oil, natural gas, propane, and other sorts of hydrocarbons that are burned would also be taxed. There is another way that you alluded to called cap and trade. That's a very complex mechanism, and I'll only give it a kind of brief once over. The idea is you do an inventory of everyone who is burning fossil fuels, or at least the bigger polluters, and you say you can only burn them if you have essentially a license or a permit. And we're going to give out only so many permits per year. We'll either hand them to you free of charge or sell them. But if you need to pollute more than this, you're going to have to buy them from someone else. They can shut down their plant and sell you their permits. And that creates an effective price per ton of CO2 emissions based on what this market price is for permits. So you have to create a complex market. You have to create a complex system of measuring how many pollutants there are. Some administrative or political agency has to decide how many permits will be allowed in any given year. There are all sorts of complexities, but it is in principle doable, and we have a cap and trade system here in California, and the EU has one as well. So it's doable, but it is very complex, and it's not something that the public will ever easily understand.
Well, you use the expression doable there a couple times. So lots of things are doable in theory, but maybe not so effective in actual practice. So how would you judge California's success or lack of success in managing carbon dioxide pollution with cap and trade?
Well, one of the problems is that we have surprisingly bad data on this. California is supposed to be carefully measuring its success, but the state legislative analyst's office has repeatedly criticized the agencies that oversee this for not really scientifically measuring their effectiveness or the economic impact of this program on various affected communities, especially disadvantaged communities. So one problem is, in some cases, greenhouse gas emissions have gone down, but people have pointed out that's only because some of the industries that cause that pollution have moved either to other states or overseas. Those are called fugitive emissions. California then imports those emissions in the form of goods that embody them, and the global atmosphere hasn't improved at all, but California touts its success. So that's kind of a fraudulent success. I am sure that with the very modest price on carbon that California has achieved, there have been some emissions reductions. But I will just add one other thing so that I don't blame everything on California. It is inherently hard for any state to achieve substantial emissions reductions when we live in a system that allows for free trade between states. If we ratchet up our price on carbon, all the emitters will leave the state. And that's because under the Constitution, only the federal government can regulate interstate commerce. So it really needs to be done at the national level, where we can use border adjustments to regulate the importation of high carbon goods and services. That's something that will be very effective, both in protecting clean industry in the United States and in encouraging other countries to follow suit with carbon fees of their own. The EU is talking about a border cost carbon adjustment right now, and the industry is abuzz with talk about how this is going to create a gigantic lever for other countries around the world, including some as far away as Australia, to start getting their act in order to meet the EU's emission standards. So that's tremendously positive. And if the US would go along, together we could bring the rest of the world behind us. Unfortunately, the Biden administration is asking the EU to go slow, and that's because we don't have our own act in order. The Biden administration would like to, but and we'll probably get into this later in the conversation, but the US is such a laggard that we would suffer if the EU put on a very worthy border carbon adjustment.
Let me just jump in here.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
A little bit more on cap and trade. Everybody knows we're out of time on climate. The Arctic, the Antarctic, they're all melting. Things are underway. Tipping points are being tripped. The oceans are heating up. The scientific news is, to put it very mildly, devastating. It's upsetting. If you're not anxious about it, you're not paying attention. So we have no more time. We're in a situation right now, sort of like Apollo 13. After it circumnavigated the moon on its abortive moon landing mission, they had to get those three guys back into the Pacific Ocean. They had one shot. It had to be the perfect re-entry, or they would either burn up or skip off the atmosphere into space. Either way, they'd be dead. But we made it because they got it right. Cap and trade has been around since the mid-90s, right? In the Kyoto Protocol. Do you see carbon emissions going down? No, they're going up faster and faster. It's been in the European Union, extremely volatile prices, which have done little to reduce emissions. Volatility is a very serious problem when you're trying to price carbon. If your industry, you're the CFO, the CEO of a cement manufacturing plant or something, or steel or automobiles, and you want to do the right thing, you need to plan ahead. You need a predictable landscape in which to plan. Otherwise, you can't sell it to the board and the shareholders to spend a couple $2 billion reworking your whole business technology. Volatility is a killer. A carbon price like we're suggesting, that's been suggested in numerous bills in the House and Senate, has predictability. Predictability is incredibly valuable. Predictability brings on industry support. We just today hear the American Petroleum Institute coming out for a predictable carbon price. Who would have thought? The oil business. The other thing about cap and trade is we've tried it. We tried it in 2009 with the Waxman-Markey bill. It failed. It failed with Obama as president and the Dems in charge of the House and Senate. They wouldn't even introduce it into the Senate, democratically controlled Senate. Why? Because they knew it would fail. One reason being is nobody can understand it. You can't understand it. It takes too long. And if you can't sell it to the public, you can't pass it in Congress. That was one of the problems with Waxman-Markey. What we're proposing can be summarized in 2 pages. Revenue neutral, fully refunded, predictably rising at a set pace with a border carbon adjustment. That's it.
Okay, so you've certainly convinced me. So we're going to put cap and trade where we're going to put it. We're going to give a timeout to cap and trade, and let's just focus in on carbon fee and what we're going to do with the money. So, of course, anytime we talk about a fee or a tax on carbon, that's the first topic, and you've already alluded to this, Peter. So the way I understand your comment is that whatever revenues after administrative costs are gathered by the federal government in this case, then those fees would be returned to the populace in general. So, and you've also alluded to a specific proposal. So just talk a little bit more about the specifics of what you're talking about, how those funds would be distributed and so on.
Well, here's the deal. The federal government is broke, right? The tax cuts of a few years ago created a huge increase in the deficit. They're now spending like crazy because we have to for COVID. 2 trillion there. Biden wants another 3 trillion. So the government is hungry for revenue. Okay, we understand that. And the politicians want to do good things with that revenue. And there's a lot that needs to be done. The problem is, once the government starts spending the revenue, it opens up the opportunity for anti-carbon tax propagandists to say, they're stealing your money. Everything's getting more expensive, but where's the money going? How do we know where it's going? They'll remember Solyndra, they'll find some way in which the government has chosen some way to spend it that's, not so great. It's inevitable. So to keep it as clean as possible and as accountable as possible, the cleanest proposal is take that money, give it all back, minus administrative costs, which of course go down over time once the program is set up. You don't need a new bureaucracy to refund the money because the government already knows how to collect taxes and send checks. They do it very well. When I recruited George Shultz to our advisory panel. He's a former Secretary of Labor, Treasury, State, and Office of Management and Budget. And I'd go down to visit with him at Stanford at least once or twice a year for the last 6 years. He just passed away. And every time I'd meet with him, I'd say, Mr. Secretary, do you still believe in full revenue return? I mean, and he's 97 years old. So he would clench his fist and almost pound the table and say, full revenue return for political reasons. It's accountable. And it's not a tax if the government doesn't keep the money. So when people say, no more taxes, it's terrible, taxes are bad. If the money's just flowing through the government and back to people, according to the former Secretary of the Treasury, I'll take that one to the bank, it's not a tax, it's a fee if all the money is returned. Now, some people say, well, why would you give it to the wealthiest? Okay, that's an argument. The wealthiest don't really need the money, but they also have the highest carbon footprint because people with more money buy more stuff. That's where your carbon footprint really is. It's embedded in the stuff we buy. So all those Amazon deliveries, that's your carbon footprint. So why shouldn't more affluent people pay more? Okay, but then who wants to start a class war? But the most important thing is that 70% of the population will come out at least even, if not better, with the fully refunded carbon tax. And that's the way you get political support, just like in Alaska. People love those checks in Alaska. People like their Social Security checks. Think of Pavlov. You get a check in your mailbox from the government that says, the government loves me. Why would industry make the investment? And there will be big investments in this transition to a low carbon future if they think that in 2 to 4 years, when the pendulum swings the other way, they'll repeal this thing, and so we won't have to do anything. They need to know that there's a floor of public support, like for Social Security, behind any kind of carbon fee. They just have to have that in order to move forward.
There have been studies by a number of economic consulting firms and by the U.S. Treasury itself. And what they do is they take what's called the Consumer Expenditure Survey. So they know what goods and services typical Americans from different income groups buy every year. And they know or can calculate roughly the how much a carbon tax or other price on carbon would increase the cost of those goods and services. So they can calculate a net increase in the cost of living for say, every different decile or tenth of income But then they can also just do the simple math of calculating, okay, with this enormous pool of several $100 billion in revenue, if we divide it up among every American individual, how much each would get, and then compare that check with the rise in the cost of living and see whether they would be net beneficiaries or losers under this system. And the good news, as Peter said, is that, and of course the calculations vary a little bit depending on how large the carbon fee is and who's doing the math, but roughly 2/3 of individuals and households would be net beneficiaries. That's great from two perspectives. One is a social justice perspective, which I think more and more Americans are aware is pretty critical with the rise of inequality and the lack of economic opportunity in this country. It's critical that we don't put the burden of a climate solution on the backs of low and moderate income Americans. It's just unacceptable. And frankly, all too many plans I've seen out there do that. They're not very open about it, but when they say, let's impose these regulations, let's say, I'm getting slightly off topic here, but let's say, for example, we propose raising fuel efficiency standards. That sounds like a good thing. So new cars will be more efficient. And other things being, if we don't do anything else, yes, fuel efficiency standards are good, but they raise the cost of new cars by requiring lots of new technology, which in turn raises the cost of used cars, which are what low-income Americans buy. And people who've studied this have found that fuel efficiency standards are very regressive, meaning they tend to hurt low-income Americans more than upper-income Americans. They are also far less effective than carbon taxes. In the case of the transportation, a carbon tax translates into a tax on transportation fuels like gasoline or diesel. A tax on gasoline has an immediate impact on greenhouse gas emissions because it means every time you take your car for a spin, you think, is this trip really necessary if I'm paying more for gasoline? Is this trip really necessary? Could I use a Zoom call instead? Could I carpool or take the bus? Maybe I could combine several shopping trips into one. Or, this is something people forget, instead of driving 80 miles an hour on the highway, they can save 20% of their mileage by driving 65. It's amazing the tax on your gasoline consumption when you drive over the speed limit. So there are lots of things people can do with existing cars if they face a gasoline tax. None of that would be affecting their behavior if it just affects new vehicles. It takes 20 years or more for new vehicles to work their way into the fleet. We don't have 20 years. We need to start now. So going back to the idea of a carbon fee and dividend, yes, a rising tax on gasoline would affect low-income people. But if you then give them a dividend, you will more than offset that cost. So they will come out ahead. They will still face the same incentive to change their driving behavior in ways that save the climate. But they will no longer be bearing the cost of this solution, unlike regulatory solutions, which are not transparent and do foist the cost onto them. So the beautiful thing, one is social justice, and then the other that Peter alluded to is if 2/3 of households are better off, maybe they would actually support this politically. And I feel very strongly that some of the opposition to carbon fee and dividend comes from those who are afraid that indeed this will become a permanent fixture of our policy landscape because it will be overwhelmingly popular.
Do regulations go away, or what happens to all the existing regulations like the Clean Air Act or the fuel efficiency standards and so on?
Should I answer that? Okay. A great many regulations today are in place for other kinds of environmental issues. So the Clean Air Act primarily regulates local air pollution, which creates smog and deadly fine particulates. Those are absolutely critically important issues and need to be addressed. We will probably need continuing regulation to address those. I will just add parenthetically here, the beautiful thing about a strong climate solution that discourages the burning of fossil fuels, we will also, in the process, greatly improve local air quality. And that will really serve the needs of environmental justice. Right now, certain disadvantaged communities bear the overwhelming brunt of both industrial and highway air pollution, and they're paying the cost in terms of their lives and their health. So if we can ratchet down fossil fuel burning, we will save lives, especially in these communities. But yes, we will need to continue a number of those regulations. Even for climate purposes, we will want selective regulations, subsidies, and standards.
Another thing I want to touch on before we get into a little bit of the politics of carbon fee and dividend kind of situation is there's a lot of people think that the fossil fuel companies should bear a lot of responsibility for the damage that's been done by fossil fuel emissions over the years. And the way of pursuing that, at least one of the ways, is through the court system. So if we had a carbon fee and dividend, what happens to all of those court cases?
Peter?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. There's a group called the Climate Leadership Council, which is Citizens Climate Lobby considers itself a grassroots organization. The Climate Leadership Council considers itself a grass tops organization. It was started by former Secretaries James Baker and George Shultz, and they have top-notch corporate execs and fossil fuel companies, ExxonMobil and Chevron, and I don't know about Chevron, BP, et cetera, as sponsors. When they first came out, they had a plan that they proposed that included tort liability protection for their fossil fuel companies, because it was at a time when lawsuits were starting to be launched. There's one here in the Bay Area. There's others, I think, New York, other such places. They've dropped that now. And I think there's a lot of public opposition to any kind of a carbon fee proposal that also shields the industry from liability. Personally, I think it's true that the fossil fuel industry has acted absolutely egregiously over the years in funding climate denial, disinformation, hassling researchers, eroding the trust in science, and it's cost us the delay.
Yeah, I hear you on that. A thought comes to mind, a difficult situation, and I'm thinking, for instance, of a country like South Africa that went through what it went through, and they could have gone on forever punishing the bad actors, but they didn't choose that path. They chose the path of reconciliation. So as bitter as that might have been for some to swallow, just like it may be bitter for some to just say, okay, well, the fossil fuel companies are going to skate. It may just be the wiser path to follow. And I can see that a good argument can be made for that.
When I give a talk, I start by thanking those who gave us fossil fuels. I mean, you could consider fossil fuels a gift from God, really. It's a gift from the past. It's fossilized sunlight. It's energy that we discovered how to use when the steam engine was first invented, and it has built our civilization. Our entire civilization is built on fossil fuels. Look around. Everything around me and everything I do depends on fossil fuels in some way, shape, or form. And we have a magnificent civilization. I'm very proud of our civilization. And those who participated in it the coal miners, the field workers in this dangerous, dirty work, or the geochemists, uh, the financiers, everybody who helped bring it forth does deserve some credit. And I think if it's a mistake to make them the enemy, uh, and there's a lot of blame to go around for the disinformation, that's for sure. I think that is shifting. It's shifting. And I have a feeling if it ever came to a court, the people who started it and were involved at the outset are gone.
Okay, and so this actually takes me directly to the direction I would like us to go here for a minute, because it does seem like there's a lot of really good evidence, a lot of good arguments can be made in favor of putting a fee on fossil fuel emissions. I'm going to use Washington State here as an example for a second. We're basically a progressive state. We're a blue state. And in the last 4 or 5 years, we've had two initiatives. We're an initiative state, which is a blessing. We've had two initiatives that would have put a price on carbon, and both of them failed miserably. There's really been a lack of momentum politically in getting us moving towards having a national carbon fee. So why is that? What do we do about it?
Could I make a comment just about Washington? And John, you're there, so you can correct me. But I see several problems that happen in Washington. First, going back to my comments about California, there's very little. These initiatives were very well-meaning, but there is almost nothing that the state of Washington and its people can do to even measurably affect the global loading of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. So such a measure would be largely symbolic. You would have the benefit of reorienting certain parts of the state's economy to be better prepared for when we finally get a national and global solution, but it's not going to affect the Earth's climate. So you're asking people to pay some kind of sacrifice for a symbolic measure. The second problem was a very deep and troublesome split in the environmental community, where in the first initiative, where money was returned in the form of, I believe, you can correct me, sales tax reductions and other tax reductions, and a number of more quote unquote progressive environmental groups really preferred seeing that money go into causes they view as green. And in some cases, that meant into the pockets of organizations that work in those communities or that deal with environmental issues. And so, of course, they vowed to come back with an initiative that would do just that. And they did, I guess it was in 2018. And the problem was a great many voters thought all this money is disappearing into some central fund to get doled out in ways that are not transparent. I believe the Seattle Times editorialized against the initiative, even though it believes that the climate crisis is very real, because it was a sort of undemocratic allocation of revenue for what? And I think we need to come around to saying, by returning revenues to every individual, we avoid this appearance of a spoil system, or as even some strong environmentalists have called it, green pork, because sending money to a community, an organization in a community, is not the same as sending money to the people who live in that community. They're the ones who are going to be paying more for gasoline and home heating. Unless they actually see the money in their bank account or pocketbook, naturally they're going to be distrustful towards something like that, which can't even promise to have an effect on the climate. So I think that the environmental community should have taken a good close look at how its own serious division helped kill this. In addition, of course, I think we must acknowledge that huge amounts of money were spent by the petroleum industry to kill it. But I think these initiatives could have won if the environmental community had united around a solution, particularly closer to the first 2016 initiative that returned a lot more money to people in ways that they could have seen the benefit.
Let me add
Yeah.
to that.
So, okay, sure.
There's a lot of literature appearing in the popular press that says carbon taxes will never work. Carbon taxes were so yesterday. Let's just move on to programs and standards. That's what's going on right now in Washington, D.C. And they use the failed 2 initiatives in Washington state as an example of, you see, we tried it, the public turned it down, let's move on, it doesn't work. They use the example of weak, ineffective carbon taxes all over the world as an example of carbon taxes don't work. Well, there's a reason for that. And instead of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, we should be learning from the mistakes of the Washington Initiative and from other countries' experiences. It's very simple, actually. Of course, carbon taxes haven't worked in countries where there's no dividend. The public won't stand for rising taxes. So a $6 a ton carbon tax is ineffective. The average global price, I believe, is around $5 or $6 a ton, except in some countries it's much higher, and there it's effective. So the answer is not, oh, carbon taxes don't work, the public doesn't like it. It's the public doesn't like a carbon tax if they're not getting anything in return. Or in the state of Washington, they mistrust an unelected group of people deciding where their tax money is going to be spent. So we should learn from that and get back to the basic principles that the entire economics profession in the United States, including superstars, in an unprecedented act of consensus. Have you ever heard of an economists all agreeing with each other? They have stated their 4 principles: revenue neutral, predictably rising, fully refunded, and a border adjustment, which is the most equitable. So we're talking social justice. Effective, we're talking how fast you can get emissions down. And efficient, which is the cost per ton of CO2 reduced. Equitable, efficient, and effective. If they're saying that, this is the economics profession, how on earth do the politicians come back and say, well, you don't understand the politics? Because politicians don't necessarily do what economists tell them to do. I understand the politics is difficult. We live in a big country. There are a lot of diverse and competing interests, and it's hard to be on the floor of the Senate and the House advocating this. But in the end, the public should be pushing the politicians to get it done because we are out of time. We're totally out of time. And the consequences of failure are unimaginable. They're unthinkable. So we've got to get it done. People have to give up a little bit. The enviros have to give up something. The conservatives need to give up something. They need to decide we're going to meet somewhere in the middle. We're going to get this done. And the best agreement is one, as you know, where everybody walks away just a little bit unhappy. Well, let me just say that the Citizens Climate Lobby has grown from a little upstart organization of 25 to an organization now of over 200,000 members in, 49 countries or something like that. I mean, it's really all over the world. And we were just recently told by a Washington consultant that our lobbying on Capitol Hill, which has been going on now for 11 or 12 years, is second only to the American Cancer Society effort. And you know how big they are. So CCL has evolved into a very well respected lobbying organization. We go into congressional offices bearing respect, gratitude for service. We are polite. We put on a coat and tie. We make an appointment. We don't barge in. And we get invited in and we pitch our case to even people who might years ago have been saying, what's the problem? There is no climate problem. We don't hear that anymore. We hear, well, how do you return the dividend? Or my community has a oil refinery. What's going to happen there? You know, specific questions that are legitimate questions for the constituents of that member of Congress. So if there's a call to action, it's join CCL.